The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Clarence House as Prince William made his way down the familiar corridor. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished marble floors, each step carrying the weight of recent months that had changed everything. The palace staff moved quietly around him, their faces bearing the same somber expression that had become commonplace since King Charles's health had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. William paused outside his father's private study, his hand hovering over the ornate brass door handle. Through the heavy oak door he could hear the faint murmur of voices, doctors, advisors, and palace officials who had become constant fixtures in their daily routine. The Prince of Wales took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders as he had been taught since childhood. Royal duty demanded composure, even when facing the unthinkable. As he entered the room, the conversations fell silent. King Charles sat behind his mahogany desk, looking frailer than William had ever seen him. The once robust monarch who had waited decades to wear the crown now appeared almost ethereal, his skin pale and his eyes holding a distant quality that spoke of someone preparing for a different kind of journey. Yet there was something else in his father's gaze, a spark of determination that William recognized from his own reflection. The royal physicians exchanged glances before quietly excusing themselves, leaving father and son alone in the study that had witnessed decades of royal decisions. Family portraits lined the walls, each one telling the story of a dynasty that had weathered countless storms. William's eyes briefly caught sight of a photograph of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, her steady gaze seeming to watch over this moment of transition. Charles gestured for William to take the seat across from him, the same chair where William had sat as a young boy, listening to stories of duty and service. Now, as a man in his 40s with children of his own, William understood the weight of those early lessons in ways he never could have imagined. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken understanding. Outside the windows, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that within these walls, history was quietly unfolding. The king reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a leather-bound folder, its edges worn smooth by years of handling. William had never seen this particular document before, and something in his father's careful movement suggested its contents were significant beyond measure. Charles opened the folder slowly, revealing handwritten pages in his distinctive script. The ink was fresh, suggesting these words had been penned recently, perhaps during the long nights when sleep eluded the ailing monarch. William leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued by the solemnity of the moment and the obvious importance his father placed on whatever lay within those pages. The ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece seemed to grow louder as Charles cleared his throat. His voice, though weakened by illness, carried the same authority that had commanded respect throughout his life. This was not simply a conversation between father and son, but a moment that would define the future of the monarchy itself. William felt his heart rate quicken as he realized this was no ordinary meeting. The careful preparation, the privacy, the formal yet intimate setting, all pointed to something momentous. His father's next words would carry implications far beyond this room, rippling through the royal family and potentially changing the course of their ancient institution. As Charles began to speak, William found himself transported back to his childhood, remembering similar moments when his father had shared wisdom about their unique role in British society. But this felt different, final, in a way that made William's chest tighten with emotion he struggled to contain. The weight of impending loss mixed with the anticipation of responsibility created a complex emotional landscape that no amount of royal training could have prepared him for. The leather folder remained open between them, its contents still hidden but somehow radiating importance. William's eyes moved from the documents to his father's face, searching for clues about what revelation was about to unfold. Whatever King Charles was about to share, William sensed it would challenge everything he thought he knew about his future role and the monarchy's direction. In that quiet study, surrounded by centuries of royal history, two men sat on the precipice of a conversation that would echo through generations. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, but for William, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for words that would change everything he thought he understood about duty, service, and the crown that would one day rest upon his head. King Charles lifted the first page from the leather folder, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the document toward the light. William watched his father's face, noting the mixture of resolve and vulnerability that flickered across his features. When Charles finally spoke, his words carried a gravity that seemed to settle into the very foundations of the ancient building around them. The king's first revelation was unexpected, yet somehow inevitable. He had been secretly working with constitutional lawyers and historians for months, crafting what he called his final gift to the monarchy. But this was not the traditional passing of crown and scepter that William had anticipated. Instead, Charles had conceived something far more radical, something that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the royal family and the British people. William's brow furrowed as his father explained the first element of his plan. Rather than simply abdicating in favor of his eldest son, Charles intended to establish what he termed a transitional monarchy. This would involve William taking on the full responsibilities of the crown while Charles remained alive, allowing for an unprecedented period of guidance and mentorship that had never before existed in British royal history. The implications were staggering. No British monarch had ever voluntarily stepped aside while still living, except for the brief and controversial abdication of Edward VIII. But Charles's vision went far beyond simple abdication. He envisioned a careful, deliberate transfer of power that would unfold over several months, allowing William to assume royal duties gradually, while benefiting from his father's experience and wisdom. As Charles continued reading from his carefully prepared notes, William felt a mixture of emotions wash over him. Pride in his father's innovative thinking battled with concern about the constitutional implications. The British monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years by adhering to tradition and precedent. What Charles was proposing would shatter centuries of established protocol. But there was more. Charles set down the first document and lifted another, this one bearing the official seal of Parliament. He had already begun preliminary discussions with the Prime Minister and key constitutional scholars. The legal framework for his unprecedented transition was not merely theoretical, it was actively being developed by some of Britain's finest legal minds. William found his voice for the first time since entering the study. His questions came in a rush. What about public opinion, the Commonwealth realms, the Church of England's response? Charles had anticipated each concern, and his answers revealed months of careful planning and consideration. This was not a hasty decision born of illness, but a thoughtful evolution of the monarchy that Charles believed was necessary for its survival in the modern world. The king's reasoning was compelling. The world had changed dramatically during his lifetime, and the monarchy needed to adapt or risk becoming irrelevant. By creating this transitional period, Charles hoped to demonstrate that the crown could evolve while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. William would benefit from unprecedented preparation, while Charles could ensure his life's work in areas like environmental conservation and interfaith dialogue would continue. Outside the study windows, the changing of the guard ceremony was taking place at Buckingham Palace, visible in the distance. The symbolic passing of responsibility from one soldier to another seemed to mirror the conversation taking place in this private room. But where the guard change was routine and temporary, what Charles was proposing would reshape the monarchy forever. William stood and walked to the window, his mind racing as he processed the magnitude of his father's plan. The crowds of tourists watching the ceremony below had no idea that history was being quietly rewritten just miles away. Their expectations of royal tradition and continuity would be challenged by this bold new approach to monarchical succession. Turning back to his father, William saw something he had rarely witnessed before: uncertainty in the king's eyes. For all his careful planning and legal consultation, Charles was still a father seeking his son's approval for a decision that would affect not just their family, but the entire nation. The vulnerability in that moment struck William more powerfully than any formal decree could have. Charles opened a third document, and William could see it bore his own name at the top. His father had prepared specific recommendations for William's early years as monarch, suggestions for modernizing certain aspects of royal protocol while preserving the institution's essential character. The level of detail was extraordinary, covering everything from public engagement strategies to private family matters. The most surprising element was Charles' recommendation that William should significantly reduce the number of working royals, streamlining the monarchy to focus on direct heirs and their immediate families. This would mean difficult conversations with extended family members who had built their lives around royal duties. But Charles believed it was necessary to create a more focused, efficient, and cost-effective royal household. As William read through his father's carefully crafted suggestions, he began to understand the true scope of the transformation Charles envisioned. This was not simply about changing when the crown would be passed, but about reimagining what the monarchy could become in the 21st century. The weight of that vision settled onto William's shoulders, adding to the already substantial burden of impending kingship. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as father and son continued their historic conversation. With each document Charles shared, William felt himself being drawn deeper into a future he had never imagined, one that would challenge every assumption about royal tradition, while opening possibilities that had never before existed in the long history of the British crown. The fourth document in Charles's folder contained what he called his personal testament, a letter addressed not to the nation or Parliament, but to William himself. As Charles handed it over, his eyes grew misty with emotion that had been carefully controlled throughout their formal discussion. This was the moment when the king set aside his crown and spoke purely as a father to his son. William's hands shook slightly as he unfolded the handwritten pages. His father's distinctive script filled every line, and the personal nature of the words hit him immediately. Charles had written about his deepest regrets, his proudest moments as a father, and his hopes for William's reign. But more than that, he had included advice about balancing the impossible demands of royal duty with the needs of a young family. The letter spoke directly to William's concerns about George, Charlotte, and Louis. Charles understood, perhaps better than anyone, the challenge of raising children in the royal spotlight while trying to give them as normal a childhood as possible. His advice was practical and heartfelt, drawn from decades of experience watching William and Harry navigate their own complicated royal upbringing. What surprised William most was his father's admission of mistakes. Charles wrote openly about times when royal duty had forced him to miss important family moments, when protocol had prevented him from being the father he wanted to be. He urged William to learn from these experiences and to find ways to put family first whenever possible, even within the constraints of monarchical responsibilities. The letter also contained Charles's thoughts about Catherine and her role as the future queen consort. His praise for William's wife was generous and specific, acknowledging how she had brought stability and warmth to the royal family while maintaining her own identity and interests. Charles expressed his confidence that Catherine would be a transformative influence on the monarchy, much as his own mother had been during her long reign. As William read on, he discovered that his father had been quietly observing and documenting William's own evolution as a royal. Charles noted moments when William had shown particular wisdom or compassion, times when he had successfully balanced duty with authenticity. The king's observations revealed a depth of paternal pride that had rarely been expressed so directly. But the letter's most powerful section dealt with the broader purpose of monarchy in the modern world. Charles shared his belief that the crown's greatest strength lay not in its historical grandeur, but in its ability to serve as a unifying force during times of national uncertainty. He urged William to embrace this role while remaining true to his own values and vision for the future. The personal testament also included practical advice about working with prime ministers, managing the complex relationship between the royal family and the media, and maintaining the delicate balance between public service and private life. Charles had learned these lessons through decades of experience, and he wanted to spare William some of the more painful learning curves. When William finished reading the letter, he looked up to find his father watching him intently. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion and understanding. This was no longer about constitutional law or political strategy. It was about love, legacy, and the sacred bond between generations of a family that happened to serve their nation in an extraordinary way. Charles then revealed the timeline he had in mind for implementing his transition plan. Rather than rushing into immediate abdication, he proposed a gradual process that would unfold over the next year. This would allow for careful preparation, public education about the changes, and constitutional adjustments, that would make the transition as smooth as possible. The first phase would involve William taking on additional ceremonial duties while Charles remained king. This would serve as a public introduction to the new arrangement, while allowing both men to adjust to their evolving roles. The second phase would see William assuming most day-to-day royal responsibilities, with Charles serving in an advisory capacity. The final phase would be the formal abdication and coronation, conducted with all the traditional pageantry that the British public expected, but adapted to reflect the unique circumstances of this transition. Charles had even consulted with the Archbishop of Canterbury about modifying certain aspects of the coronation ceremony to acknowledge the unprecedented nature of the succession. William found himself thinking about his children and how this accelerated timeline would affect their lives. George, as the future heir, would need to begin understanding his destiny much earlier than originally planned. Charlotte and Louis would grow up in a world where their grandfather's innovation had fundamentally changed what it meant to be royal. The weight of these revelations was beginning to settle into William's consciousness. This was not just about becoming king sooner than expected, it was about inheriting a transformed monarchy that would require him to be both a custodian of tradition and an agent of change. The responsibility felt overwhelming and exhilarating in equal measure. As the day drew toward evening, Charles closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. He had shared his vision, his plans, and his heart with his son. Now came the most difficult part, waiting for William's response to a proposal that would reshape not just their family's future, but the very nature of the British monarchy itself. The study fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the clock, marking moments that would soon be remembered as the turning point when the House of Windsor chose evolution over tradition, innovation over precedent, and the future over the weight of 1,000 years of history. William stood frozen in that moment, his father's words echoing in his mind as the full magnitude of the situation crashed over him like a wave. The leather folder lay closed on the desk between them, but its contents had opened a door to a future that William had never imagined. His carefully planned life, built around the assumption of decades more preparation, had just been fundamentally altered by his father's extraordinary vision. The silence stretched between father and son, filled with unspoken emotions and the weight of centuries of royal precedent. William's mind raced through the implications, not just for himself but for Catherine, for their children, for the millions of people across the Commonwealth who looked to the monarchy for stability and continuity. Everything he thought he knew about his destiny had shifted in the span of a single afternoon. Charles watched his son's face carefully, recognizing the same expression of overwhelmed responsibility that he himself had worn decades earlier when faced with the reality of his royal destiny. But this was different. William was being asked to embrace not just the traditional burdens of kingship, but to become the architect of a new form of monarchy that had never existed before. William finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and uncertainty. He asked about Catherine's reaction to this plan, and Charles smiled for the first time that day. The king revealed that he had already spoken with his daughter-in-law, and her response had been both practical and supportive. Catherine understood the challenges but recognized the unique opportunity to shape the monarchy's future in ways that previous generations of royal wives had never been able to do. The conversation turned to the children, and William's protective instincts as a father became clear. How could they explain to George that his path to the throne had suddenly accelerated? How could they help Charlotte and Louis understand that their lives would change dramatically? Charles had considered these questions extensively, and his answers revealed the depth of his planning and his genuine concern for his grandchildren's well-being. Charles suggested that the children should be told gradually, with age-appropriate explanations that emphasized the positive aspects of the transition. George, now old enough to understand basic concepts of duty and service, could begin learning about his future role in a more structured way. Charlotte and Louis would benefit from seeing their parents navigate this change with confidence and purpose. The king also revealed that he had been consulting with child psychologists and education experts about the best ways to prepare royal children for accelerated responsibilities. His concern for his grandchildren's emotional health was evident in every detail of his planning, showing that even in crafting this revolutionary approach to succession, He had not forgotten the human cost of royal duty. William asked about the rest of the royal family, and Charles's expression grew more serious. Not everyone would understand or support this decision. Some family members had built their identities around traditional royal roles, and the streamlined monarchy Charles envisioned would necessarily reduce their public prominence. These conversations would be among the most difficult aspects of implementing the transition plan. Charles had already begun reaching out to key family members, starting with his siblings and working through the extended royal network. The responses had been mixed, ranging from enthusiastic support to barely concealed disapproval. But Charles was determined to move forward, believing that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to adapt to changing times. The discussion then moved to public opinion and media reaction. Charles had commissioned private polling to gauge how the British people might respond to such an unprecedented change. The results were encouraging. Younger demographics especially seemed open to modernization of the monarchy, while older generations appreciated the idea of a planned, dignified transition rather than uncertainty about the future. However, both men understood that public opinion could shift rapidly once the plan became public. The media's response would be crucial, and Charles had already begun careful conversations with key journalists and royal correspondents. His strategy involved emphasizing the benefits of stability and continuity that the transition plan would provide, rather than focusing on the break with tradition. William found himself thinking about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, and what she might have thought of such a radical departure from royal protocol. Charles seemed to read his thoughts, sharing that he had discussed similar ideas with his mother during her final years. While she had not lived to see this specific plan, she had expressed support for the monarchy's need to evolve with the times. The weight of that revelation struck William deeply. Knowing that his beloved grandmother had contemplated such changes made his father's proposal feel less like a betrayal of tradition and more like a natural evolution of her own forward-thinking approach to monarchy. The Queen had spent 70 years modernizing royal practices in subtle ways, and this felt like a continuation of her legacy rather than a rejection of it. As evening approached, Charles revealed one final surprise. He had already set preliminary plans in motion, regardless of William's response. Certain constitutional consultations had begun, key advisors had been briefed, and initial legal frameworks were being drafted. This was not a theoretical discussion. It was a reality that would unfold whether William embraced it enthusiastically or simply accepted it as inevitable. The realization that his father had moved beyond seeking permission to implementing a decision hit William with unexpected force. This was Charles exercising his authority as king in perhaps the most dramatic way possible, using his constitutional power to reshape the very institution he served. It was both inspiring and intimidating to witness such decisive leadership from a man William had always seen primarily as his father. The revelation that his father had already begun implementing the transition plan left William grappling with emotions he had never experienced before. As the future king, he had always known his destiny, but this sudden acceleration felt like being thrown into deep water without warning. Yet as he sat in that historic study, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had faced their own moments of unprecedented challenge, William began to understand the courage his father was showing. Charles continued speaking, his voice growing stronger as he outlined the specific timeline for public announcement. Within the next month, they would begin preparing the British people for this historic change. The announcement would be carefully orchestrated, starting with private briefings for Commonwealth leaders, then moving to Parliament, and finally to the public through a series of carefully planned media appearances. William's mind immediately went to the practical implications of such an announcement. The constitutional lawyers would need to work overtime, Parliament would require special sessions, and every detail would be scrutinized by media outlets around the world. The announcement of this transition would be one of the most significant royal news stories in modern history, comparable to his grandmother's passing or his parents' divorce. But Charles had anticipated these challenges and had spent months preparing for them. He had assembled a team of communications experts, constitutional scholars, and royal historians to help craft the narrative around this transition. The goal was to present it not as a desperate measure due to his illness, but as a thoughtful evolution of the monarchy designed to serve the British people better. The king then shared details about his own future role after abdication. Rather than disappearing from public life entirely, Charles planned to continue his charitable work and environmental advocacy, but without the formal authority of the crown. He would become something unprecedented in British history, a former monarch who remained active in public service while his son wore the crown. This arrangement would require careful navigation of protocol and public expectations. Charles would need to step back from certain ceremonial duties while finding new ways to contribute to causes he cared deeply about. William would need to establish his own authority as king, while still benefiting from his father's experience and wisdom. William asked about the international implications of this decision, particularly how Commonwealth nations would react to such an unprecedented change. Charles had already begun quiet consultations with Commonwealth leaders, and their responses had been generally positive. Many appreciated the transparency and planning involved, seeing it as evidence of the monarchy's commitment to responsible governance. However, some Commonwealth realms had expressed concerns about the constitutional implications within their own systems of government. Charles had assured them that the transition would be handled with full respect for each nation's constitutional arrangements, and that no changes would be imposed without proper consultation and agreement. The conversation then turned to the practical aspects of coronation planning. William had always assumed his coronation would take place years, possibly decades in the future. Now he was facing the reality of preparing for this momentous ceremony within the next year. The logistics alone were staggering: Westminster Abbey, international guests, security arrangements, and the complex ceremonial protocols that had evolved over centuries. Charles had already begun preliminary discussions with the Earl Marshal and other officials responsible for coronation planning. His vision was for a ceremony that honored tradition, while reflecting the unique circumstances of this transition. Certain elements would be adapted to acknowledge Charles's continued presence and his role in William's preparation for kingship. The most emotionally challenging aspect for William was contemplating how this would affect his relationship with his father. They had always been close, but this transition would fundamentally alter their dynamic. Charles would no longer be his future king, but would become something entirely new, a former monarch offering guidance to his successor. William worried about the emotional toll on his father. Stepping away from a role he had waited decades to assume and had performed with such dedication, despite facing personal challenges and public criticism, Charles seemed to sense these concerns, explaining that he had found peace with this decision through extensive reflection and prayer. The king revealed that his illness had given him clarity about what truly mattered. Rather than clinging to power or tradition for its own sake, he wanted to use his remaining influence to ensure the monarchy's future success. He believed that by stepping aside while still able to guide William through the early years of his reign, he could make a more meaningful contribution than by holding on to the crown until death. As the day drew toward its close, Charles asked William to take time to process everything they had discussed. While many elements of the plan were already in motion, William's enthusiastic support would make the transition much smoother and more successful. Charles wanted his son to embrace this opportunity rather than simply endure it. William stood and walked to the window once more, looking out at the London skyline that would soon be his to serve in an entirely new capacity. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, each one representing lives that would be affected by the decision made in this room. The weight of that responsibility was immense, but for the first time since entering his father's study, William felt a spark of excitement about the possibilities ahead. The monarchy his children would inherit would be different from anything that had come before, more flexible, more responsive to changing times, and more intentional about its role in modern society. While the transition would be challenging, it also represented an unprecedented opportunity to shape the future of one of the world's oldest institutions. When William turned back to his father, Charles saw something new in his son's expression, a combination of determination and acceptance that suggested William was beginning to embrace, rather than simply accept, his accelerated destiny. 3 weeks after that transformative conversation in his father's study, William found himself standing in the same spot where he had first heard Charles's unprecedented plan. But everything had changed. The initial shock had given way to careful planning, and what had once seemed impossible now felt like destiny unfolding exactly as it should. The announcement had been made to the world just days earlier, and the response had exceeded even Charles's optimistic projections. While there had been some criticism from traditionalists, the overwhelming reaction had been one of admiration for the monarchy's willingness to evolve and adapt. International leaders had praised the thoughtful approach to succession, and public opinion polls showed strong support for the transition plan. William had spent those 3 weeks in intensive preparation, working with constitutional experts, communication specialists, and royal historians to ready himself for the enormous responsibilities ahead. Catherine had been remarkable throughout the process, her calm strength serving as an anchor while everything around them shifted and transformed. The children had taken the news better than expected. George, with the seriousness that marked his character, had asked thoughtful questions about his own future role. Charlotte had been excited about the prospect of her father becoming king, though she didn't fully grasp what that would mean for their family. Louis, still young enough to adapt easily to change, had simply accepted the new reality with the flexibility of childhood. Charles had been energized by the positive response to their announcement. His health, while still a concern, seemed to have stabilized, and he threw himself into the transition planning with enthusiasm. The collaborative approach to succession had given him a sense of purpose that was visible to everyone around him. The first official ceremony of the transition had taken place the day before, when William formally assumed several of his father's key constitutional duties. The handover had been conducted with dignity and ceremony, creating new traditions while honoring old ones. Charles had remained present throughout, symbolizing the continuity and stability that the monarchy represented. Now, as William prepared for his first major address to the nation as king designate, he reflected on how much his understanding of duty and service had evolved in just 3 weeks. The role he was about to assume was both exactly what he had always expected and completely different from anything he could have imagined. The speech he would deliver that evening had been carefully crafted to acknowledge the unprecedented nature of the transition while emphasizing the monarchy's enduring commitment to the British people. William had worked personally on every word, wanting to strike the right tone of humility, determination, and hope for the future. Catherine joined him in the study as he reviewed his notes one final time. Her presence brought the same sense of calm and perspective that had sustained him throughout this whirlwind period. Together, they had navigated the challenges of explaining the transition to their children, managing the media attention, and preparing for the enormous changes ahead. The Queen Consort Designate had also been remarkable during the transition period. Her natural grace and genuine warmth had won over skeptics who wondered how she would handle the increased responsibilities. The British people were clearly ready to embrace her as their future queen, and her approval ratings had reached new heights following the announcement. Charles appeared in the doorway, moving with more energy than William had seen from him in months. The collaborative nature of the transition seemed to have given the king a renewed sense of purpose and vitality. Father and son embraced, a gesture that would have been unusual in the formal context of royal duty but felt entirely natural, given their shared mission. The 3 generations of the royal family had found their rhythm in this new arrangement. Charles brought wisdom and experience, William contributed energy and fresh perspectives, and the children represented the future that would benefit from this unprecedented approach to succession. The monarchy was evolving while maintaining its essential character. That evening's address would mark another milestone in the transition process. William would speak directly to the British people about his vision for the monarchy and his commitment to serving with the same dedication his grandmother had shown throughout her remarkable reign. The speech would be broadcast around the world, marking a new chapter in the long history of the House of Windsor. As the time for the broadcast approached, William felt a deep sense of gratitude for his father's courage in proposing this revolutionary approach to succession. What had initially seemed like a shocking departure from tradition now felt like exactly the right response to the challenges and opportunities of the modern world. The monarchy his children would inherit would be stronger, more flexible, and more relevant than ever before. Charles's final gift to the institution he had served his entire life was this blueprint for adaptation and renewal. The crown would pass to the next generation not through the tragedy of death, but through the wisdom of planned transition. Standing in that study where everything had changed just 3 weeks earlier, William no longer felt frozen by the magnitude of what lay ahead. Instead, he felt ready to embrace a destiny that was both ancient and entirely new, backed by his father's wisdom, his wife's strength, and the support of a nation ready for this bold step into the future. The address that evening would be just the beginning of William's reign, but it would also be the culmination of Charles's most important contribution to the monarchy, proving that even the most traditional institutions could evolve, adapt, and thrive when guided by wisdom, courage, and an unwavering commitment to service. The surprise that had initially taken everyone's breath away had become the foundation for a stronger, more resilient crown that would serve the British people for generations to come.